Ted Kimball and Ronnie Kimball, Jr. In 1995, Pleasant Garden, North Carolina, was the kind of town where violent crime felt distant. Patricia Kimball was known as a young wife, trying to build a stable life. Friends described her as trusting and committed to her marriage. Like many people, she believed she understood the person closest to her. But investigators would later discover that danger had already entered her life long before the crime itself. Ted Kimball, her husband, was described in court as someone struggling financially. Records would later show growing pressure tied to money and stability. Prosecutors would argue that behind normal appearances, Ted had begun thinking about solutions that would lead toward violence. Ronnie Kimball, Jr., Ted's younger brother, was someone Ted trusted. Family loyalty would later become a key part of the prosecution's case. Investigators would argue that Ted relied on that loyalty to carry out a plan he did not want, directly traced to himself. To the outside world, they were simply brothers. But behind the surface, prosecutors said they were forming a criminal agreement. The point of no return came when Ted Kimball allegedly made the decision to turn financial pressure into a murder plan. According to investigators, Ted had recently secured a life insurance policy on Patricia, worth approximately $200,000. Prosecutors would later argue this policy became the central financial motive behind what followed. Authorities said Ted recruited Ronnie to carry out the killing. In 1995, Patricia Kimball was found dead inside her home. Forensic examination later confirmed she had been shot in the head, but the scene also showed something else: fire damage. Investigators determined the house had been intentionally set on fire after the shooting. Prosecutors argued this was an attempt to destroy evidence and disguise the killing as an accidental fire. But fire investigations often reveal more than they conceal. Arson specialists examined burn patterns, ignition points, and accelerant traces. Their findings suggested the fire had been deliberately set after Patricia was already dead. This shifted the case immediately from accidental death to homicide. Detectives began assembling the investigation thread: insurance records, financial documents, phone contacts, relationship history. Investigators began asking a central question: who benefited from Patricia's death? The insurance policy quickly drew attention. Authorities examined Ted Kimball's financial situation and recent actions. At the same time, they examined Ronnie Kimball's movements and connections to the crime scene. Interviews and evidence collection began forming a clearer picture. Eventually, investigators concluded that Ted had orchestrated the crime while Ronnie carried out the shooting and set the fire. During the legal process, prosecutors focused on the agreement between the brothers: Ted as the planner, Ronnie as the direct actor. A division of roles often seen in conspiracy cases. Ronnie Kimball, Jr. was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Ted Kimball later pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including murder, arson, and conspiracy. His sentence totaled 107 years in prison, effectively ensuring he would spend the rest of his life incarcerated. For investigators, the case reflected another recurring pattern in violent crime: murder motivated not by rage, but by calculation. When financial desperation mixes with entitlement, some offenders begin seeing people not as family, but as obstacles or opportunities. The Kimball case also highlighted how family loyalty can be manipulated, how trust between brothers can be turned into a criminal tool rather than a protective bond. And it left behind a difficult reflection, often discussed in similar cases. As at what point does financial pressure become moral collapse? When does solving a problem become creating something irreversible? Across cases involving brothers, investigators often see how shared decisions strengthen dangerous plans. Not because both start equally committed, but because once agreement is reached, resistance disappears. Because sometimes the most dangerous sentence spoken between brothers is not an order. Sometimes it is simply, "I'll help you." Dustin and Brett Merrick, Greene County, Ohio. April 2017. Dustin Merrick was 25. His younger brother Brett was 24. They grew up close in age, close in environment, and according to later testimony, close in loyalty. Those who knew them described Dustin as intense and easily angered. Brett was often seen as quieter, less dominant, but present. Their lives were tied not only by blood, but by work. Dustin worked for his uncle, William "Skip" Brown. Brown was more than family. He was also Dustin's employer, a man who had given him opportunities, stability, income, at least on the surface. To outsiders, the relationship looked ordinary, a nephew working for a relative, a practical arrangement built on trust. But behind the surface, tensions had been building. Prosecutors would later state Dustin had developed deep resentment toward Brown. And the exact reasons varied in reporting. Some suggested financial disputes, others described personal dislike. One statement from the prosecution summarized it simply: Dustin hated Skip. That hatred would become central to everything that followed. The point of no return came when Dustin decided confrontation was no longer enough. On a day in April 2017, Dustin entered Brown's apartment in the Yellow Springs area. He was armed. What followed was fast and deliberate. Brown was shot and fatally wounded inside his own residence. But the violence did not end there. Sherry Mendenhall, a neighbor and friend of Brown, heard the disturbance. Concern brought her to the apartment. She was not part of the conflict. She was not involved in any dispute. She simply walked into the wrong moment. When she entered to check on Brown, Dustin shot her as well. She died from her injuries. 2 lives lost within minutes. 1 targeted, 1 incidental, and Brett was there. Investigators later confirmed Brett Merrick was present during the events. He did not fire the weapon, but prosecutors argued his presence and assistance helped enable the crime. His role would become central to the legal outcome, because sometimes being present becomes participation. The investigation moved quickly. Crime scene analysis confirmed firearm evidence. Witness accounts placed both brothers near the apartment. Timeline reconstruction showed their movements before and after the shootings. Digital records and interviews further strengthened the case. Authorities focused not only on who pulled the trigger, but who helped make the situation possible. Brett's legal exposure came from what prosecutors described as complicity rather than direct violence. 2 brothers, different roles, same event. During trial proceedings, prosecutors described Dustin as the driving force. The shooter, the one carrying the grievance, the one who made the fatal decisions. Brett's defense focused on reduced responsibility. They argued he did not initiate the violence, that he followed rather than led, that his involvement did not reach the same legal threshold. The court ultimately agreed there was a distinction. Dustin Merrick received life without parole. The sentence reflected both the intentional killing of Brown and the second killing of Mendenhall. The court described the actions as deliberate and irreversible. Brett Merrick faced a different outcome. After pleading guilty to reduced charges including involuntary manslaughter, he received a 25-year sentence. The plea acknowledged involvement while recognizing he was not the shooter. Again, 2 brothers. Again, 2 sentences. The case left behind familiar psychological questions seen in other sibling crimes. How does loyalty become silence? How does presence become permission? When does failure to stop violence become part of the violence itself? Because Brett didn't fire. But he did not leave either. Experts often describe this as passive facilitation. Situations where individuals do not initiate harm but create the conditions where harm continues. It is a quieter form of involvement, but courts increasingly recognize its impact. Violence rarely exists in isolation. It often depends on who stands nearby. And the Merrick case also highlighted how personal resentment can grow unchecked when conflict remains unresolved. Sometimes the most dangerous partnerships are not formed by strangers. They are formed by brothers. Dakota Saldivar and Michael Wilson. Pahrump, Nevada, 2018. Homes are supposed to be places of safety, but sometimes the greatest danger exists behind locked doors no one else can see. In the quiet desert town of Pahrump, Nevada, daily life moved at a slow pace. Modest homes, long stretches of road, families living ordinary routines, nothing that would suggest a crime that would later disturb the entire community. Dawn Liebig was known as a parent trying to manage a household with teenagers. Like many parents, she balanced discipline with responsibility. Reports later described a home where rules existed, expectations existed, and like many households, disagreements were not unusual. Living in that home were two teenage boys, Dakota Saldivar, 17, and his half-brother Michael Wilson, also 17. Both were still legally minors. Both still living under parental authority. Both still navigating the difficult years between childhood and adulthood. To outsiders, they appeared like many teenagers. Quiet, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes frustrated. Nothing that clearly signaled what investigators would later uncover. To the outside world, it may have looked like an ordinary family managing ordinary tensions. But behind the surface, prosecutors would later describe a growing resentment inside the home. Arguments, discipline, complaints, small conflicts that over time began shaping anger rather than resolution. Investigators would later suggest that what seemed like typical domestic conflict had slowly become something more serious in the minds of the two boys. The point of no return came one night in 2018, when authorities say the brothers made a decision that could never be undone. According to prosecutors, the two teenagers attacked Dawn Liebig while she was asleep. Court descriptions focused on the forensic findings rather than emotional details. Medical examination confirmed fatal injuries caused by both sharp force trauma and blunt force trauma. Authorities stated the attack involved both brothers acting together. The violence itself lasted only minutes. But the decisions that followed would become just as significant to investigators. Prosecutors said the brothers worked together to conceal what they had done. Investigators later testified that the body was buried in a shallow grave near the home. The concealment effort suggested awareness of the seriousness of their actions. At first, Dawn Liebig was simply missing. Questions began forming. Friends and acquaintances noticed her absence. Communication stopped. Concern slowly replaced routine. Investigators began with standard missing person procedures, interviews, timeline reconstruction, examination of the home environment. But something did not feel consistent. Detectives began noticing contradictions in statements and behavior, small details that did not match, timelines that required closer examination. Then, the investigation took a critical turn. Authorities eventually uncovered evidence that led them to the burial site near the residence. The discovery transformed the case from a disappearance into a confirmed homicide investigation. Attention quickly focused on the two teenagers living in the home. During questioning, investigators reported that both Dakota Saldivar and Michael Wilson admitted involvement. According to public reporting, part of their explanation centered on ongoing domestic frustrations. One report indicated they expressed being tired of ongoing conflict and complaints within the household. For investigators, the explanation did not lessen the severity. Instead, it raised deeper psychological questions about conflict management, adolescent development, and how unresolved anger can become dangerous when combined with immaturity and poor judgment. As the case entered the legal system, the focus turned to accountability. Because both suspects were juveniles at the time, the legal process involved careful consideration of age, intent, and rehabilitation potential. Still, the prosecutors emphasized the coordinated nature of the killing and the concealment that followed. Ultimately, the court reached a decisive conclusion. Dakota Saldivar received a sentence of 18 years to life. Michael Wilson also received a similar long-term sentence reflecting his equal participation. The sentences reflected both the seriousness of the crime and their age at the time it occurred. For investigators and psychologists alike, The case reflected one of the most difficult realities in violent crime analysis. Violence within families often grows from unresolved emotional environments rather than single explosive events. Sometimes it is not one argument, but many, sometimes not one moment, but a buildup of many small ones. For the Pahrump community, the case left a lasting discomfort, and a reminder that some of the most difficult crimes to understand are those involving young offenders and family victims, and it left behind a difficult question that appears again and again in similar cases. How does frustration become justification in the minds of the young? And how many warning signs remain invisible until it is too late? While this case showed how domestic resentment can turn fatal inside a household, the next case would show how entirely different pressures can also push siblings toward irreversible choices. Brian and David Freeman, Salisbury Township, Pennsylvania. February 1995. Families are often seen as places of protection, but sometimes they become places of silent division. Brian Freeman was 17. David Freeman was 16. Two teenage brothers growing up inside what appeared to be a strict but structured household. Their parents, Dennis and Brenda Freeman, were described as religious and disciplined. They wanted structure, rules, direction. To neighbors, they looked like a normal American family. But inside the home, tensions had been growing. Brian had begun adopting extremist beliefs. His appearance changed, his behavior became more confrontational, his thinking became more rigid. David, younger and impressionable, followed closely behind. Their parents tried to intervene. They restricted Brian's associations. They pushed back against his ideology. They attempted to regain control, but control was exactly what Brian had begun to reject. David soon mirrored that resentment. The brothers became increasingly isolated from their family structure. Their shared anger slowly became a shared worldview, and their home became divided into sides. To the outside world, this looked like teenage rebellion. Conflict between parents and sons is not uncommon. Disagreements over lifestyle and beliefs happen in many households. But behind the surface, the anger was hardening into something far more dangerous. The point of no return came when the brothers decided their parents were obstacles, not authority. On a night in February 1995, that decision turned into action. Inside the family home, Dennis Freeman was attacked first. Brenda Freeman was also killed. Their youngest son, 11-year-old Eric Freeman, was also murdered. Investigators would later describe the crime scene as controlled and deliberate, rather than chaotic. 3 victims, 1 family. Authorities would later determine the brothers did not act completely alone. Their cousin, Nelson Birdwell, was also involved in helping them after the killings. His role would later become part of the broader prosecution narrative. After the murders, the brothers fled. Their disappearance triggered immediate concern. Police began tracking movements. Reports surfaced of stolen property and attempts to remain hidden. Investigators examined extremist connections, friend circles, and known associates. Every lead painted a clearer picture of planning rather than panic. The investigation relied heavily on timelines. Travel patterns, statements from acquaintances, items taken from the home. Eventually, enough evidence accumulated to locate and arrest the brothers. The case quickly gained attention across Pennsylvania, not only because of the brutality, but because of the ages involved, teenagers. The trial revealed disturbing psychological themes. Prosecutors described resentment toward parental authority, anger over religious restrictions, frustration over lifestyle limitations, extremist ideology reinforcing their hostility, a mixture of rebellion and radicalization. Defense teams pointed to youth and immaturity. They argued developmental factors, peer influence, psychological vulnerability, but the severity of the crime weighed heavily on the court. The original sentence reflected that weight. Both Brian and David received life sentences without parole. The decision placed them among the most serious juvenile offenders in the state. For decades, their case remained part of the national discussion about juvenile sentencing laws. But legal standards began changing. Years later, Supreme Court decisions across the United States forced reconsideration of life without parole sentences for juveniles. Courts began reviewing whether teenagers should face permanent incarceration without the possibility of review. The Freeman case returned to court. In 2024, both brothers were resentenced. Their new sentence became 60 years to life. The ruling did not erase the crimes, but it reflected evolving legal views about youth and long-term punishment. Still, the facts of the crime remained unchanged. 3 family members lost. 1 household destroyed. The psychological questions remain just as difficult. How does ideology override family bonds? How does shared anger become shared violence? And how does one sibling reinforce the other's worst instincts? Because neither brother acted alone. Each validated the other. Experts often point to reinforcement theory. When extreme beliefs go unchallenged within a closed pair, they can intensify. Doubt disappears. The Freeman case became a warning about how radical beliefs combined with adolescent instability can escalate inside family systems. Not all violence begins with strangers. Sometimes it begins with arguments at the dinner table. And sometimes it ends there too. While this case showed how ideology and rebellion could destroy a family from within, the next case would reveal how resentment and personal hatred could turn brothers into partners in calculated murder once again. Jacob and Joshua Hitchcock, Carter County, Tennessee, 2023. On the surface, the Hitchcock family appeared ordinary, a rural Tennessee family connected by land, history, and shared roots. But beneath that quiet exterior, tensions had been quietly building for years. William Bill Hitchcock Jr. was known as a hard-working man. Friends described him as private but dependable. He had spent much of his life managing his property and maintaining control over family assets. To neighbors, he represented stability, a man who believed strongly in ownership, structure, and personal responsibility. His 2 sons, Jacob and Joshua Hitchcock, were part of that same world. Jacob, the older brother at 31, was described as more calculated and reserved. Joshua, 25, was seen as quieter but deeply influenced by his older sibling. People who knew them said the brothers were close. They spent time together. They shared frustrations, and eventually, prosecutors would argue, they shared something much darker. To the outside world, this was simply a family with disagreements. But behind the surface, a dispute over property and inheritance had begun shaping dangerous resentment. Investigators would later outline growing tensions surrounding real estate. Plans to sell property reportedly created fear about lost inheritance, financial expectations, control of land, and who would benefit when the time came. What began as arguments slowly hardened into something more permanent. The point of no return came when prosecutors say the brothers made a joint decision that would permanently change their family forever. In 2023, authorities say Joshua Hitchcock shot his father. And according to court testimony, the act was not spontaneous. Prosecutors argued it followed planning and discussion between the brothers. A decision formed through shared anger and financial fears. The crime scene itself reflected a controlled but deliberate act. Investigators documented ballistic evidence and physical traces that supported a close-range shooting. There were no signs of outside intrusion, no unknown suspects. Everything pointed inward, but what happened afterward would become just as important. Authorities later uncovered evidence of a cover-up attempt. Prosecutors said efforts were made to conceal what had happened and delay discovery. Investigators focused on inconsistencies in timelines and behavior following the disappearance of William Hitchcock. At first, there were questions. Where was he? But why had he suddenly stopped communicating? Those questions slowly turned into suspicion. Then came the discovery that shifted everything. The body of William Hitchcock Jr. was eventually located following investigative work that included interviews, physical searches, and analysis of statements. What initially appeared to be a missing person case quickly became a homicide investigation. And investigators were already looking very close to home. Phone records, witness statements, and forensic timelines began forming a narrative. Detectives compared movements, communications, and actions after the killing. Prosecutors later argued the brothers' actions showed coordination both before and after the crime. Joshua eventually admitted to being the shooter. But the case did not end there. Jacob's role became a central legal question. Prosecutors argued he was not just aware, but actively involved in planning and concealment. Evidence presented suggested participation beyond mere knowledge. The courtroom phase would ultimately focus on intent, not just who pulled the trigger, but who helped make the decision. During trial proceedings, prosecutors described a shared motive rooted in property control and inheritance fears. Defense arguments attempted to separate levels of responsibility, but jurors were ultimately persuaded by the prosecution's theory of joint participation. The verdict brought a clear legal conclusion. Both Jacob and Joshua Hitchcock were convicted of first-degree murder. Jacob was also convicted on charges related to evidence tampering. The court determined both had crossed the legal threshold of intentional participation. The sentence was equally definitive. Both brothers received life sentences in prison. In the end, what remained was not just a legal outcome, but a psychological question that investigators often confront. How does a family dispute become fatal? At what point does resentment become justification in someone's mind? Cases like this often reveal how violence inside families rarely begins with violence. It begins with pressure, expectations, fear of loss, and the quiet belief that something is being taken away. The Hitchcock case became another reminder of a difficult truth. The most dangerous conflicts are often the ones people believe they deserve to win, and sometimes the cost of that belief cannot be reversed, while financial control and inheritance disputes shaped this case. And the next story would show how violence can also erupt without long histories or personal grudges, sometimes from a single night that spirals beyond control. Roman and Ruslan Glukoy, Placer in Sacramento County, California, 2014. Some crimes begin with the intention to harm. Others begin with smaller decisions that spiral into consequences no one planned to face. In early 2014, two twin brothers were moving through Northern California with little indication that their actions would soon lead to tragedy. Roman Glukoy and Ruslan Glukoy were both 19 years old. At that age, they stood at the edge of adult responsibility. But investigators would later argue their decisions showed a dangerous disregard for it. People who encountered them did not initially see violent offenders. Instead, prosecutors later described a pattern of property crimes, car break-ins, theft, opportunistic crimes rather than personal attacks. To the outside world, these looked like non-violent offenses. But behind the surface, investigators would later explain how quickly property crime can evolve into life-threatening situations once suspects attempt to escape capture. The events that would define the case began with a series of vehicle burglaries. Authorities later said the brothers were moving through neighborhoods targeting unlocked vehicles, collecting items, moving quickly, avoiding attention. But that night, their actions drew police attention. The point of no return came when law enforcement attempted to stop them, and the brothers chose to run instead of surrender. What followed became a rapidly escalating chain of decisions. Investigators later reconstructed the timeline through dispatch records, patrol reports, and vehicle tracking. At one stage of the escape, Roman Glukoy drove as the brothers attempted to distance themselves from officers. But as the situation intensified, they abandoned one vehicle and stole another. This second decision proved fatal. Authorities said Ruslan Glukoy took control of a stolen truck during the later phase of the pursuit. The vehicle became the center of a high-speed police chase across public roads. Speeds increased, traffic signals were ignored, officers attempted to contain the situation while minimizing risk to the public. But high-speed pursuits often leave little room for correction. At a major intersection, investigators said the stolen truck ran a red light. The collision that followed was catastrophic. Jose Tovar, 35, and his 14-year-old daughter, Anahi Tovar, were traveling through the intersection when their vehicle was struck. Emergency responders arrived quickly. Medical teams attempted intervention, but both victims died from injuries sustained in the crash. For investigators, the case immediately shifted from a pursuit to a homicide investigation. The crime scene documentation focused on impact analysis, vehicle speeds, point of collision, signal timing. Forensic crash reconstruction specialists examined debris patterns and vehicle damage to determine exactly what happened in the final seconds. The evidence confirmed what officers already suspected. The fatal crash occurred during an active felony flight from law enforcement. The brothers were taken into custody soon after. During the investigation, prosecutors focused not only on who was driving at the moment of impact, but on the shared chain of decisions that created the situation. Roman's earlier role in the escape and Ruslan's final actions behind the wheel became central legal questions. The courtroom phase centered heavily on legal definitions of felony murder. Prosecutors argued that deaths occurring during the commission of dangerous felonies placed responsibility on both participants, even if only one physically caused the crash. Defense teams attempted to separate levels of responsibility between the brothers, but prosecutors emphasized the continuous nature of their joint actions from burglary through flight. In the end, the court reached different conclusions about each brother's level of legal responsibility. Ruslan Glukoy, who was driving the stolen truck at the time of the fatal collision, was convicted of first-degree murder. His sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Roman Glukoy was convicted of second-degree murder for his role in the chain of events leading to the crash. He received a sentence of 30 years to life. Both brothers were 21 years old at the time of sentencing. For investigators, the case illustrated a difficult but consistent reality. Many fatal crimes do not begin with the intention to kill. They begin with decisions to avoid consequences, run instead of stop, escalate instead of surrender, risk strangers instead of accepting arrest. For the Tovar family, the loss was immeasurable. A father and daughter gone because of a chain of choices made by people they had never met. Cases like this often leave behind one central reflection: how many tragedies could be prevented if the first bad decision was also the last. Roni and Josue Castaneda Ramirez, August 2019, Chino, California. On a warm August evening in 2019, friends and family gathered to celebrate a wedding. Music filled the reception hall. People laughed, danced, and took photographs to remember the start of a marriage that had only just begun. Joe Stephen Melgoza was at the center of that celebration. Just hours earlier, he had exchanged vows. Those who knew him described him as friendly and easygoing, someone who valued family and relationships. That night was supposed to be one of the happiest of his life. But outside the circle of celebration, two young men would soon become part of a very different story. Roni Castaneda Ramirez, 28, and his younger brother Josue Castaneda Ramirez, 19, had also been present at the reception, and reports later indicated they had either been asked to leave or had caused tension during the event. The exact trigger remained somewhat unclear, but what happened next was not. To the outside world, it looked like a minor disturbance, but behind that brief confrontation, something had already begun escalating. Witnesses later told investigators the brothers left the location. For a short time, it seemed the situation had resolved itself. The celebration continued. Guests returned to dancing and conversation, but the night was not over. The point of no return came when the brothers returned to the reception, armed with baseball bats. Prosecutors would later describe this return as a deliberate escalation, not a spontaneous argument, a decision to come back prepared for violence. What followed happened quickly. Investigators described a confrontation that turned physical within moments. Witness testimony would later describe confusion, shouting, and attempts by guests to intervene. Joe Melgoza became the central victim of the attack. The violence was described in court through forensic language, rather than emotion. Medical testimony confirmed severe blunt force trauma consistent with repeated strikes. Emergency responders attempted life-saving measures, but the injuries proved fatal. Just hours after his wedding ceremony, Joe Melgoza was dead. Investigators arriving at the scene began assembling what they often call an evidence montage. Surveillance footage, guest cell phone recordings, physical evidence left behind, statements from dozens of witnesses. The timeline became critical. Records showed the brothers leaving and then returning. Witness accounts described their behavior. Forensic examination confirmed weapon use consistent with bats recovered during the investigation. Detectives also examined intent. Was this planned? Was it retaliation or something else? Prosecutors ultimately argued the case reflected a violent escalation rather than a long-standing personal motive. There was no deep personal relationship between the brothers and the victim. No long history of conflict. Instead, the violence appeared rooted in pride, confrontation, and a decision to return rather than walk away. As the case moved through the legal system, the courtroom became the place where those decisions were examined in detail. Prosecutors focused on the act of leaving, obtaining weapons, and returning as proof of conscious escalation. Defense attorneys raised questions about intent and emotional reaction, but the prosecution maintained the return with weapons showed awareness of the likely consequences. In 2023, the jury reached its decision. Both Aroni and Josue Castaneda Ramirez were convicted of second-degree murder. The verdict reflected the jury's conclusion that while the killing may not have been premeditated in the traditional sense, the actions showed clear disregard for human life. Sentencing followed with another decisive outcome. Each brother received a sentence of 18 years to life in prison. For investigators, the case reflected a different kind of violence than family disputes or financial motives. This was not about inheritance. Pete and Pat Bondurant, 1986, Tennessee-Alabama border. In the mid-1980s, rural communities along the Tennessee and Alabama border were quiet on the surface. But investigators would later uncover a hidden criminal environment operating within that same quiet landscape. Pete and Pat Bondurant, twin brothers, were both 31 years old in 1986. To some people, they appeared charismatic, to others unpredictable. But behind the surface, authorities would later describe a pattern of intimidation, violence, and control. People connected to them reportedly lived in fear. Not always because of what had already happened, but because of what might happen next. The point of no return came as the brothers' criminal activity began intersecting with people they believed were problems. One of those people was Gwen Duggar. Investigators later determined that both brothers participated in her murder. Court records described a sustained assault followed by a fatal shooting. The violence was presented in court through forensic findings, focusing on cause of death rather than emotion. Authorities would later argue the killing was connected to control, a reaction to conflict within their criminal circle, possibly tied to fear of exposure. The exact combination of motives remained murky. But Gwen Duggar would not be the only victim connected to the brothers. Ronnie Gaines was another name investigators would link to the Bondurants. In this case, Pat Bondurant was found primarily responsible. Prosecutors described another killing connected to disputes and perceived threats. Then came the case of Terry Lynn Clark. Pete Bondurant would later be connected to Clark's death, which also involved arson. Investigators testified that fire had been used as part of the effort to destroy evidence, a tactic sometimes seen when offenders attempt to erase physical traces. By this point, investigators were no longer looking at isolated incidents. They were looking at a pattern. Detectives began assembling what would become a complex investigation thread. Witness statements from people inside the brothers' circle, forensic links between locations, behavioral patterns connecting victims. Fear made the investigation difficult. Some witnesses hesitated, Others delayed cooperation, but over time, the picture became clearer. Authorities described an environment where violence had become a method of problem-solving, where perceived threats were removed rather than avoided, where control mattered more than consequences. Eventually, arrests followed. In court, prosecutors presented the brothers not just as individuals who committed crimes, but as participants in a shared environment of criminal activity. Evidence tied both Pete and Pat Bondurant to Gwen Duggar's murder, leading to convictions for both men. Pat Bondurant also received a life sentence for the murder of Ronnie Gaines. Pete Bondurant was convicted in connection with Terry Lynn Clark's killing and the related arson. Unlike his brother, his legal path would eventually diverge. After serving decades in prison, Pete Bondurant was released in 2016, following completion of his sentence related to that conviction. Pat Bondurant, however, remained sentenced to life imprisonment. The legal outcomes closed the court cases. But like many multi-victim cases, they left deeper questions behind. Investigators often reflect on how environments shape behavior, how criminal subcultures can normalize extreme actions, how repeated exposure to violence can lower the psychological barrier to committing it. Anthony and Nathaniel Cook, Toledo, Ohio, early 1980s. Violence sometimes grows quietly, far from public attention, and sometimes it grows inside the same family. To many who knew them, Anthony Cook appeared controlled and observant. He was 31, older, calculated, a man who seemed to study people more than speak to them. His younger brother Nathaniel, just 22, often followed his lead. Friends later described a powerful influence between the two. They were brothers, but more importantly, they were partners. To outsiders, they were simply two young men moving through Toledo's neighborhoods like anyone else. Nothing about their daily movements suggested what investigators would later uncover. But beneath that surface, something far darker was forming. Those who later studied the case would describe a dangerous dynamic. St. Anthony appeared dominant. Nathaniel appeared eager for approval. Their bond was not just familial, it was operational. And that bond would soon become deadly. The point of no return came when the brothers began selecting victims together. Investigators later concluded the attacks were not spontaneous. Victims were approached, isolated, and overpowered. The pattern suggested planning. Control mattered more than theft. Power seemed to matter more than money. Thomas Gordon became one of the known victims. So did Peter Sawicki. Both were targeted without any personal dispute or family connection. Detectives would later say the randomness increased the fear surrounding the case. The violence itself followed a chilling consistency. Victims were abducted. They suffered severe injuries. Many did not survive. Forensic reviews suggested prolonged attacks rather than impulsive acts. But one victim lived. Cheryl Bartlett Phan would later become one of the most important witnesses. She survived an encounter with both brothers. Her testimony would provide investigators with rare insight into how the pair operated together. She described fear, control, coordination between the two men. Most importantly, she confirmed something detectives had begun to suspect. This was not one killer, it was two. The investigation slowly began connecting separate incidents. Police reviewed missing persons reports. They compared timelines, locations, witness descriptions. Patterns began aligning. Phone records placed the brothers near multiple incident areas. Witnesses recalled seeing two men together before certain disappearances. Forensic evidence began reinforcing what had once seemed like isolated crimes. Two brothers, moving together, hunting together. Investigators also examined possible motives. Robbery did not appear to explain the brutality. Many victims were not significantly robbed. Instead, reports increasingly suggested racial hostility and sadistic behavior as primary drivers. The crimes were not about gain. They were about domination. Eventually, the evidence became too strong to ignore. Arrests followed. The city of Toledo began learning how long the violence may have continued without detection. And, How many lives had intersected with the brothers' path? During legal proceedings, prosecutors presented a portrait of calculated partnership. Anthony was described as the leader, Nathaniel as the willing participant. Together, they formed something more dangerous than either alone, a functional killing unit. The court process brought final outcomes, but not equal consequences. Anthony Cook received life imprisonment. He would remain incarcerated with no release expected. The court determined his leadership role and direct involvement warranted the harshest penalty. Nathaniel's path ended differently. Through a plea arrangement and cooperation factors, he eventually became eligible for parole. Decades later, in 2018, he was released after serving many years behind bars. Two brothers, two outcomes, but the same past. The case forced investigators and psychologists to confront difficult questions. How does violence become normalized between siblings? How does loyalty become complicity? When does influence become control? And how many warning signs are missed when danger develops inside a family unit? The Cook brothers became a lasting example of how violence can be reinforced through relationships. It shows how partnership can accelerate violence, and how difficult it can be to separate leadership from participation when both hands leave damage behind. Because sometimes the most disturbing question is not who led, but why someone followed. While shared brutality defined this case, the next story would show how ideology and family conflict could turn brothers against their own home.